The truth about ancient Egypt they're still hiding is a truth that cannot be silenced, a truth that rises from the sands of time, a truth that echoes through pyramids, temples, and monuments, still standing after thousands of years, a truth carved into stone and painted on walls that cannot be erased by lies. For too long, the world has been taught a distorted picture of Egypt, dressed up in fragments that hide its African soul, its African genius, its African identity. For too long, classrooms, textbooks, and scholars have spoken of Egypt as though it were separate from Africa, as though it were something mysterious that came from nowhere, as though its greatness was an exception and not the continuation of the brilliance of African civilizations that stretched across the continent. But the truth, the undeniable truth, is that ancient Egypt was Africa's crown jewel, a civilization born from the Nile, rooted in the soil of the continent, carried by the wisdom, labor, and brilliance of African people. And no amount of rewriting, no amount of distortion, no amount of historical theft can erase that fact. When you look at the pyramids, you are looking at the work of African engineers who, without modern machines, without steel cranes, without computers, mapped the stars, measured the earth, calculated the angles, and built monuments so precise that even modern science marvels at them. When you see the hieroglyphs carved into the walls, you are seeing the language of African scribes, a system of writing that laid the foundation for literacy and record-keeping across the world. When you witness the temples of Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel, you are not seeing alien wonders or foreign mysteries. You are seeing the architectural mastery of African builders whose legacy has outlasted empires, conquerors, and centuries of deceit. And yet the story of Egypt has too often been stolen from Africa, taken apart and repackaged to make it appear as if its origins were somehow European, Middle Eastern, or from another world entirely. They wanted to separate Egypt from Africa because to admit its truth is to admit that Africa is not a dark continent without history, but the mother of civilization, the source of knowledge, the beginning of human greatness. Think about the Nile. That mighty river stretching thousands of miles gave birth to agriculture, cities, and kingdoms. Its flooding nourished the land, and its waters connected people from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean. Egypt was not isolated. Egypt was a meeting point, a bridge between inner Africa and the wider world. The gold that flowed from Nubia, the ebony, the ivory, the soldiers, the queens, the knowledge, they all came from Africa's heartlands, from kingdoms like Kush that stood beside Egypt, sometimes in rivalry, sometimes in partnership, but always as family. They do not tell you that some of Egypt's greatest rulers, like the 25th dynasty Pharaohs, were Nubians, Africans whose black skin and royal crowns reminded the world that Egypt's throne belonged to Africa. They do not tell you that long before Greece and Rome rose to power, African doctors in Egypt were performing surgery, African astronomers were mapping the heavens, African mathematicians were charting the movements of the stars and creating calendars that guided harvests and festivals. They do not tell you that philosophy, religion, law, and governance in the Western world borrowed heavily from what was already present in Africa's Nile Valley. And yet, despite the evidence carved into stone, painted on walls, written in papyrus scrolls, they still hide the truth. Museums across Europe and America are filled with stolen statues, stolen mummies, stolen gold, stolen tablets, stolen history. They sit behind glass displays labeled with foreign names, stripped of their African identity, presented to the world as if they were never connected to the people of the continent that gave them life. School children grow up seeing images of Egypt where the faces are lightened, the noses reshaped, the African features erased, so that when they imagine the builders of Egypt, they imagine people who look nothing like the descendants of Africa. This is not an accident, it is deliberate. Because if Africa's children knew the truth, if they knew that the first great civilization of mankind was theirs, if they knew that the pyramids, the temples, the science, the medicine, the art, the philosophy were theirs, then they would rise with pride, they would walk tall, they would know they come from greatness. But the truth has a way of breaking through. No matter how many lies are told, no matter how many textbooks are rewritten, no matter how many artifacts are stolen, the stones themselves speak. The walls of tombs still show brown and black faces painted proudly. The statues still carry the features of African people, The DNA evidence, the archaeological findings, the linguistic connections all point back to Africa. Even the Greeks themselves, men like Herodotus, traveled to Egypt and wrote in awe that they were learning from a civilization older than theirs, that Egypt's priests, its temples, its mysteries were rooted in a wisdom they could only borrow but never claim as their own. They admitted what modern historians try to deny, that Greece learned from Africa, that Europe's so-called enlightenment was lit by a flame that was carried out of Africa's cradle. So why do they still hide it? Because truth is power. If you strip a people of their history, you strip them of their identity. If you make them believe they came from nothing, they will accept anything. If you erase their ancestors' greatness, they will never look for it in themselves. This is why Africa was painted as a place of darkness, why Egypt was cut out of Africa and placed into a false history. Because to admit the truth is to admit that the descendants of Africa are the descendants of kings, queens, scholars, engineers, scientists, and philosophers. To admit the truth is to admit that the very foundation of modern civilization was built by African hands. But we must remember, we must reclaim, we must tell the truth that has been buried under centuries of lies. We must teach our children that Africa is not the story of slavery, colonization, and poverty alone, but the story of civilizations that taught the world. We must tell them that before the ships came, before the chains, before the borders and partitions, Africa was the light of the world. We must remind them that the pyramids still stand, not as tombs of the dead, but as monuments to a living truth that cannot be destroyed. They were built to last forever, and so is the memory of the people who built them. The truth about ancient Egypt, they're still hiding, is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future. It is about awakening a sleeping giant. It is about healing the wounds of identity. It is about rewriting what was torn from the pages of history. And when we finally embrace this truth, when we finally stop looking to others to tell our story and start telling it ourselves, we will rise again with the strength of those who built wonders that still humble the world. For the same spirit that built Egypt runs in the blood of Africa's children today. The same genius, the same resilience, the same vision, the same power. And no matter how much they try to hide it, the truth is eternal. The truth is unbreakable. And the truth is Egypt is Africa's crown jewel. Not because outsiders said so, not because the world one day decided to admire it, but because from the moment its civilization rose upon the banks of the Nile, it represented the brilliance, discipline, creativity, and power of African people. For thousands of years before Europe began to imagine what civilization meant, Egypt was already writing its story in stone, building monuments so enduring that they remain standing as the oldest and greatest symbols of human achievement. Yet the tragedy of our time is that Egypt's African soul has been carefully hidden under centuries of lies, stolen identities, and rebranded myths. The pyramids are shown as mysteries that came from nowhere. The temples are framed as curiosities disconnected from the land around them, and the hieroglyphs are presented as puzzles too complex to have been created by Africans. But the truth is plain to see if you open your eye. Those stones were laid by African engineers who mastered mathematics and astronomy with a precision so sharp that modern scientists still struggle to explain it. The Sphinx, the obelisks, the tombs of pharaohs, all of them are silent teachers whispering that Africa was never a land of darkness but the birthplace of light. When you walk along the Nile, when you imagine its floods watering the soil, you must understand that this river gave life not only to crops, but to a vision of society that has guided humanity for millennia. Agriculture, irrigation, architecture, calendars, governance, all of these emerged from the genius of African people who refused to be limited by their environment and instead learned to shape it. They looked to the stars and saw maps. They measured the sun and saw time. They built monuments not for vanity but for legacy, designed so that long after their voices were gone, their truth would remain. That is why the pyramids stand so tall, why the hieroglyphs still sing across thousands of years, why the statues carved in granite and limestone look back at us with eyes that say we were here, we mattered, we were great. But history was rewritten to steal that truth. Generations were taught to believe that Egypt was somehow not African, that its greatness must have come from outside influence. They showed images of pharaohs with altered faces, lightened skin, reshaped noses, to erase the unmistakable African identity. They filled museums with treasures stolen from the land and labeled them as relics of the Middle East, separating Egypt from its mother continent as if it were an island floating in a sea of myth. yet no amount of distortion can erase the evidence. The art on the walls still shows African features. The statues still carry broad noses and full lips. The royal lines of Nubia still sat proudly on Egypt's throne, proving that the Nile Valley was ruled by Africans, whose bloodlines ran deep into the heart of the continent. Egypt is Africa's crown jewel because it reflects not only its own greatness but the greatness of all the civilizations that connected with it. Nubia, Kush, Axum, and other kingdoms along the Nile shared in this glory, trading gold, ivory, and wisdom, intermarrying, influencing, and reminding the world that Africa was not a scattered land but a vast network of strength and innovation. When outsiders came to learn from Egypt, they were learning from Africa. Greek philosophers studied in Egyptian temples, Roman leaders borrowed from Egyptian governance. Even religion, myth, and philosophy in other parts of the world carried the fingerprints of African thought that had been nurtured in the Nile Valley for centuries. To accept this truth is to recognize that what the world calls Western civilization has roots in African soil. Why then do they still hide it? Because to admit that Africa produced the first and greatest civilization is to destroy the lie of African inferiority. To admit that Africans mapped the stars, built enduring monuments, performed complex surgeries, and wrote sophisticated texts, is to admit that the foundations of modern knowledge belong not to Europe but to Africa. And if the descendants of Africa knew this fully, they would stand unshaken in pride, refusing to bow to lies, refusing to believe they were born from nothing. That is why the crown jewel was stolen, polished with false narratives, displayed as though it did not belong to Africa. But the jewel always remembers its setting, and Egypt always remembers its continent. The pyramids were not tombs of forgotten kings, they were declarations of permanence. They were messages written to time itself saying, "We are here, and we will not vanish." And so even though conquerors came and went, even though borders shifted, even though the story was stolen and rewritten, the stone remained. The hieroglyphs still speak. The monuments still rise, and every time the world looks in awe at them, they are looking at Africa's crown. They are looking at a jewel so brilliant that it could never truly be hidden, no matter how much deception tried to cover it. Egypt is Africa's crown jewel because it shines for all Africans, past and present. It tells us that genius does not begin in Europe, it begins in Africa. It tells us that civilization is not something imported to the continent, it is something born from its soil and its rivers. It tells us that greatness is not foreign to Africans, it is their inheritance. And when we claim that truth, when we teach our children that their ancestors built wonders the world still studies, we restore dignity, confidence, and identity. The jewel was never lost, it has always been ours. It has always belonged to Africa. For centuries, the greatest theft was not only of gold, ivory, or treasures carried away from African soil, but of memory itself, of stories rewritten and names erased, of a history deliberately broken into pieces so that the children of Africa would not recognize themselves in the mirror of time. The tragedy of Egypt is not only in the monuments looted from its temples and displayed in foreign museums, it is in the way its very identity was stolen and reshaped to fit a narrative that kept Africa in chains long after the shackles of slavery were broken. When the colonizers looked at Egypt, they did not see it as part of the same Africa they had called backward and uncivilized, so they carved it out of the map in their minds, painting it as something foreign, mysterious, and disconnected from the continent that gave it life. This separation was intentional, for they understood that pride in history is power, and to strip a people of their memory is to strip them of their ability to rise. That is why in classrooms around the world, Egypt is taught as if it belongs everywhere but Africa. That is why the faces of the pharaohs were whitened in books, their noses chipped from statues, their blackness ignored, so that when the descendants of Africa looked at those images, they would see nothing of themselves reflected back. A people told that their ancestors had no civilization, no greatness, no science, no art, will begin to believe it, and in that belief, they can be controlled. This is how the theft of identity became the greatest weapon used against Africa, not just the theft of land and resources, but the theft of dignity. Imagine the effect of being told generation after generation that your ancestors were only slaves, that your homeland was only darkness, that the light of civilization came from others. Imagine what that does to a child's mind, to a nation's spirit. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine if that child knew the truth, that their ancestors built the pyramids, aligned monuments with the stars, created mathematics and medicine, governed vast and organized kingdoms, traded across oceans and deserts, and taught the world knowledge it still uses today. That truth would ignite pride, resilience, ambition, and self-respect. This is why the truth was hidden, because it carried the power to awake. And so Egypt, Africa's most shining jewel, was stolen not only in artifacts, but in identity, reshaped into a story where Africans were written out of their own greatness. Museums became vaults of stolen memory, textbooks became tools of deception, and history itself became a weapon. The theft did not stop in the past. It continues even today. When films portray Egyptians with faces that do not reflect Africa, when documentaries describe the Nile Valley as if it existed outside of the continent, when artifacts taken during colonization remain locked away in European capitals, the same lie is being repeated. Egypt is made to look like an isolated miracle, instead of what it truly was, the crown of African civilization, connected deeply to Nubia, Kush, and the kingdoms that stretched across the continent. This deliberate disconnection is one of the greatest crimes against truth, for it robs Africans of their rightful heritage while offering the world a distorted picture. But history, no matter how much it is rewritten, cannot be silenced forever. The faces painted on tomb walls, the DNA traced in ancient remains, the features of the statues, the testimonies of Greek historians who admitted learning from Egyptians, all point back to Africa. The evidence refuses to bow to lie. And so the challenge now is for the descendants of Africa to reclaim what was stolen, to demand not only the return of artifacts locked in foreign vaults, but the return of memory, the return of pride, the return of truth. Because without history, identity is fragile, but with history, identity is unshakable. When Africans know that Egypt is theirs, when they know that the builders of pyramids shared the same soil, blood, and spirit, they will walk taller, they will teach their children differently. They will no longer see themselves through the lens of colonizers, but through the eyes of their ancestors. Stolen history created stolen identity, but reclaimed history can restore a powerful identity that no one can take away again. The greatest monuments of Egypt were designed to outlast time itself, and in that design they hold a promise that no matter how much truth is hidden, it will rise again, just as the Nile rises each year, unstoppable and life-giving. The theft was great, but the truth is greater, and it is waiting to be reclaimed. The story of Egypt cannot be told without the story of Nubia, because the two are bound together like the waters of the Nile and the banks that hold them, inseparable, flowing in one current of history that carried the genius of African people for thousands of years. Yet for too long this truth has been buried. The role of Nubia reduced to a footnote, its greatness dimmed so that Egypt could be made to appear as a miracle standing alone. But the monuments, the tombs, the temples, the oral traditions, and the memory of a people all testify that Egypt's rise was not the work of isolation, but the work of connection, and that Nubia was not a shadow at the edge of Egypt's glory, but a partner, a rival, source of strength and culture that shaped the Nile Valley in ways the world still does not fully understand. The very stones of Nubia bear witness to this. For in the lands of Kerma, Napata, and Meroe stand pyramids and temples built by African hands, evidence that the same genius that raised the great pyramids of Giza also lived further south, and that greatness flowed up and down the Nile like the floods that gave life to the land. When Egypt was young, Nubia already had settlements and trade routes, already worked with copper and gold, already commanded the respect of neighbors. The exchange between the two was not only of goods, but of ideas, of soldiers, of rulers, of spiritual belief. Egyptian armies marched into Nubia, but Nubians also marched into Egypt, not only as warriors, but as kings. The 25th dynasty of Egypt, known as the Kushite dynasty, placed black pharaohs on the throne, rulers who restored temples, revived traditions, and extended Egypt's pharaohs like Pa, Shabaka, and Taharqa were Nubians whose power and vision left marks that even later conquerors could not erase. They were Africans ruling Africa, and their legacy is proof that the Nile Valley's greatness was not the story of one land, but of a shared civilization that stretched for hundreds of miles. Nubia was the gateway to Africa's riches, the source of gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals that fed Egypt's wealth and prestige. But it was more than resource. Nubia contributed warriors who were so fierce that even Egyptian records described their skill with the bow, calling them the land of the bow, a symbol of strength feared and respected in battle. Nubian culture brought new styles of pottery, music, fashion, and spiritual traditions that blended into Egyptian society, showing that influence flowed both ways. When Egypt weakened, Nubia rose strong, carrying the torch of Nile Valley civilization further south to Meroe, where iron smelting and advanced industry thrived at a time when many parts of the world had yet to master such technique. This was Africa's chain of brilliance, one link connected to another, proving that civilization did not stop at Egypt's borders but extended deep into the heart of the continent. Yet modern retellings often erase this connection, presenting Nubia as a lesser shadow, a mere supplier of resources, rather than a civilization in its own right. They minimize the fact that for nearly a century, Nubian pharaohs ruled Egypt as legitimate heirs, protecting traditions that Egyptians themselves had neglected. They downplay the fact that Nubian pyramids still stand today, more numerous than those in Egypt, silent reminders of a people who carried on the legacy long after Egypt's decline. This erasure is not accidental. It is part of the same pattern that sought to detach Egypt from Africa, for to acknowledge Nubia is to acknowledge that Africa's greatness was not confined to one corner but was widespread, resilient, and interconnected. To acknowledge Nubia is to see Africa as a continent of civilizations, not as a land waiting for outside influence. The truth is that Nubia and Egypt were siblings of the Nile, sometimes competing, sometimes clashing, but always shaping one another. Their histories are like two voices singing in harmony, each making the other stronger, each carrying the song of Africa further into the world. Without Nubia, Egypt's story is incomplete, and without Egypt, Nubia's influence cannot be fully seen. Together they form a chain of memory that connects today's Africans to a heritage of warriors, builders, philosophers, and rulers. The statues of Tahaka in temples as far away as Kawa, the pyramids of Meroe rising against the desert sky, the records of Herodotus and other outsiders who marveled at the black pharaohs ruling Egypt. All of this is evidence that the Nubian connection cannot be denied. When Africans remember Nubia, they remember that Africa's power was never confined to one place. They remember that when Egypt faltered, Nubia carried on the flame. They remember that the Nile was not a boundary but a highway of culture and strength, linking peoples who shared blood, trade, and vision. And when that memory returns, when the Nubian connection is reclaimed, it restores what was stolen. It tells Africa's children that their ancestors did not only build wonders in Egypt, but also built them in Nubia, that their bloodline runs through pharaohs and queens who ruled with wisdom and courage, that their heritage is not a fragment but a vast and unbroken chain of greatness. The Nubian connection is proof that Africa's story cannot be told in fragments, that its truth is too vast to be hidden, and that its legacy is far too powerful to be erased. The truth about Egypt is not only written in its monuments of stone, not only in the pyramids that scrape the sky or the temples whose pillars still stand, but in the knowledge it carried, a knowledge so profound that it became the seed from which the world's intellectual tradition sprouted. What happened along the Nile was not merely the building of cities, it was the building of thought, the shaping of ideas that would outlive empires, the birth of sciences and philosophies that carried humanity forward. For centuries, the priests, scribes, doctors, and astronomers of Egypt studied the heavens, measured the earth, cataloged the body, and recorded their findings on papyrus, leaving behind a treasury of wisdom that others would later claim as their own. To speak of Egypt without speaking of its knowledge is to miss its greatest gift, for what made it remarkable was not only the ability to stack stone upon stone, but the vision to order life with principles that guided time, health, governance, and belief. It is here that medicine was organized into detailed texts, where physicians understood diseases, described injuries, and even performed surgical operations that astonished later generations. It is here that astronomy was so advanced that monuments were aligned with the stars, calendars were charted with precision, and the cycles of the sun and moon were known well enough to guide agriculture, festivals, and spiritual life. It is here that mathematics was more than counting grain. It was geometry capable of designing pyramids whose angles still baffle modern engineers, algebra that calculated taxes and resources, architecture that planned entire cities with logic and balance. The Greek philosophers, who are praised as the fathers of knowledge, were themselves students of Egypt's schools. Men like Pythagoras, Plato, and Thios traveled to the Nile to sit at the feet of African priests, to listen in temples that had already stood for centuries before Greece had built its first stone monument. Herodotus himself, called the father of history, admitted that Greece borrowed heavily from Egypt, that its gods, its rituals, and its sciences were learned from the Nile Valley. Yet when history was rewritten, Egypt's role was diminished and the credit was shifted to others. The world was taught that knowledge was born in Athens when, in truth, Athens was only a branch of a tree whose roots reached deep into African soil. Rome, too, borrowed from Egypt, adopting symbols, architecture, and even spiritual practices, yet seldom acknowledging the source. The truth is that without Egypt's wisdom, the so-called Western civilization would not have risen in the way it did, for it was Africa's knowledge that shaped the foundations of thought upon which Europe later built. Consider the calendar that orders our day. It traces its structure back to Egypt, where careful observation of the stars and the flooding of the Nile created a solar calendar of 35 days, a system so accurate that it forms the basis of the modern one. Consider medicine, where the Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus describe ailments, treatments, and surgical practices that show clear understanding of anatomy, diagnosis, and healing long before Hippocrates in Greece. Consider architecture, where obelisks, columns, and domes inspired structures later adopted by Rome and carried into Europe, yet the originators of those ideas are rarely credited. Consider law and governance, where Egypt's principles of Ma'at, balance, truth, and justice formed the ethical framework that guided society, concepts echoed in later philosophical and legal traditions across the world. All of these reveal that the knowledge of Egypt was not locked in its borders but radiated outward, shaping societies near and far. But what makes this truth powerful is not only the recognition of influence but the realization of ownership. These achievements were not accidents, nor were they gifts from outside. They were the result of African genius, cultivated over centuries, preserved in temples, guarded by scribes, passed down through dynasties. They were the product of minds that looked at the stars and saw more than light, that looked at the body and saw more than flesh, that looked at numbers and saw patterns that could build eternity. This is the inheritance of Africa, the proof that the continent was not a passive land awaiting enlightenment from others, but the very source of life. Yet by erasing this truth, by presenting Egypt as separate from Africa, the world has been taught to admire the knowledge but deny its origin, to use the gifts but ignore the givers. Imagine if every child of African descent was taught this truth from the beginning. Imagine if they grew up knowing that the equations they study in school, the calendars they use each day, the medical practices that save lives all trace back to their ancestors. Imagine if they could see themselves not as receivers of borrowed knowledge but as the descendants of those who created it. That knowledge would not only shape their pride, it would shape their future, awakening a confidence that no system of oppression could extinguish. For just as Egypt's knowledge shaped the world then, so too can Africa's children shape the world now if they reclaim the memory of what was stolen. The legacy of Egypt's wisdom still breathes through the monuments and manuscripts that survive. The stones that align with solstices still whisper of astronomy. The surgical tools discovered in tombs still speak of medicine. The papyrus texts still echo with the voices of scribes who knew that truth once written cannot be erased. The attempt to hide the African origin of this knowledge is an attempt to break the link between past and present, but that link remains unbroken for those who seek it. The knowledge that shaped the world is not a foreign inheritance, it is Africa's gift to humanity. And when this is finally recognized, when it is taught without distortion, the stolen chapters of history will be restored, and the children of Africa will once again walk in the light of their own brilliance, carrying forward the same spirit that once illuminated the banks of the Nile and spread across the world. The truth about Egypt, the truth about Africa, the truth about identity has been hidden under layers of lies for centuries, but no lie lasts forever, and the time has come for the children of Africa and the world to reclaim what was stolen, to lift the veil and look with clear eyes at the greatness that has always been theirs. Reclaiming the truth is not about nostalgia. It is not about simply remembering monuments or reciting names of pharaohs. It is about restoring a broken chain of identity, about standing once more in the dignity that was stripped away, about teaching the next generation that they are heirs to genius, not victims of fate. When you reclaim the truth, you do not only correct a history book, you correct the vision of an entire people. You heal wounds that were left open by centuries of deception. You replace shame with pride, weakness with strength, silence with voice. To reclaim Egypt as Africa's crown is to reclaim Africa's place in the world. For Egypt was not an exception, but a shining jewel of a wider civilization that stretched deep into the continent. To reclaim the truth is to refuse the lies that Egypt was somehow separate, to say with certainty that the people who built those pyramids, carved those temples, and wrote those texts were Africans, and their blood still flows in millions today. This act of reclamation is more powerful than any monument because it transforms the mind. A child who grows up hearing only of slavery and colonization may walk with bowed shoulders, believing that their past holds no greatness. But a child who grows up knowing their ancestors measured the stars, healed the sick, governed kingdoms, and built wonders that still stand will walk taller, think broader, and dream without limit. Reclaiming the truth is therefore not only about the past, it is about the future, about arming the next generation with knowledge that empowers them to rise. Every stolen artifact returned to African soil, every hidden manuscript studied and taught, every corrected history lesson given in classrooms is not simply a fact regained, it is a piece of dignity restored, a fragment of identity returned to its rightful owners. Reclaiming the truth means demanding that the world acknowledge Africa's role as the mother of civilization, but more importantly, it means Africans themselves must see it, believe it, and live it. The resistance to this truth proves its power. Why else would so much effort be spent in whitening the faces of pharaohs in textbooks, in portraying Egypt in films with actors who do not reflect its people, in locking away treasures in European museums? Because those who rewrote history knew that pride is dangerous to those who wish to control. If Africa remembers its greatness, it will never again accept inferiority. If the descendants of Africa see themselves in the builders of pyramids, they will no longer believe they were born only to suffer. This is why reclaiming the truth is revolutionary. It breaks chains that are not on the body but on the mind. It restores what was always there but hidden. It breathes life into identities that were suffocated. It gives back the mirror so that Africa's children can finally see themselves clearly. The pyramids still stand for a reason. They were built to last forever, not only as tombs but as eternal messages to time, that greatness cannot be erased. The same is true of the truth itself. You can bury it, you can hide it, you can twist it, but it will rise again just as the Nile rises, just as the sun returns each morning. Reclaiming the truth is like that rising sun, unstoppable, inevitable, shining light into places that have been kept dark for too long. And once the light shines, once the truth is spoken, no force on earth can put it back into silence. Reclaiming the truth is also a duty. It is the responsibility of every teacher, every parent, every storyteller, every artist, every leader to pass on what was hidden, to make sure the next generation does not grow up blind. It means filling classrooms with the knowledge of Africa's civilizations. It means honoring the names of rulers like Pie, Tahaka, and Hatshepsut. It means teaching about Nubia, Kush, and Meroe alongside Egypt. It means showing that Africa was not waiting for history but making it. It means telling children that the knowledge they study in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy has roots in their own ancestors' minds. It means making sure that when they look at the pyramids, they do not see distant ruins but family achievement. The future depends on this reclamation. A continent that knows its history cannot be dismissed. A people who know their roots cannot be uprooted. A generation who sees greatness in their past will demand greatness in their future. Reclaiming the truth is not about excluding others. It is about including Africa in the story from which it was erased. It is about balance, about justice, about setting the record straight so that all humanity can see clearly where civilization began. Because when Africa's truth is hidden, the world itself is incomplete, its story fractured. But when Africa's truth is reclaimed, the story of humanity becomes whole, and the contributions of Africa shine as they always should have. So let the monuments remind us, let the scrolls whisper to us, let the bloodline call us back to memory. The truth belongs to us, and it is waiting for us to reclaim it. No matter how much they tried to hide it, it is still here, etched into stone, carried in genes, kept alive in oral traditions, and rising again in the voices that refuse silence. Reclaiming the truth about Egypt is reclaiming Africa's pride, reclaiming Africa's strength, reclaiming Africa's soul. And when that truth is fully embraced, no lie will ever again have the power to chain us, because the knowledge of who we are will shine brighter than any falsehood, and the world will once more see Africa not as forgotten but as the eternal cradle of greatness.